They mocked the way he held his rifle, said his grip looked wrong, like he didn't even know how to fire it. But what they didn't know was that the man in the polished boots and ceremonial gloves had trained with units. Most people aren't allowed to mention. And when he finally raised that rifle, his so-called wrong grip put 10 rounds through the dead center, without missing once, before we reveal what happened next. Tap that subscribe button and drop a comment, telling us where you're watching. From now, let's get into it. The Sussex countryside in late afternoon has this particular quality to the light, golden, but fading casting long shadows that make everything look like it's waiting for something to happen. The Hawkesbury Civilian Range sat wedged between rolling farmland and an old forestry shed, weathered brick and corrugated metal that had absorbed decades of rifle smoke and conversation. This wasn't your typical weekend shooting gallery. The Hawkesbury was serious business, the kind of place where conversations happened in murmurs and everyone knew everyone's capabilities. Without asking, battered Land Rovers dominated the car park, their wheel wells caked with mud that spoke of country living rather than suburban pretense. Lance Sergeant Felix Ward hadn't planned to stop the footpath from Petersfield Station back to his rented flat curved right past the range entrance, and he'd walked this route dozens of times after pulling ceremonial duty at Buckingham Palace. Today's morning rotation had been standard 2 hours of the famous stillness, while tourists took selfies and asked questions. He couldn't answer. His dark blue service dress still carried the faint scent of gun oil and brass polish. His white gloves, folded with parade ground precision under his belt, exactly as regulations demanded. This wasn't costume jewelry military. This was the real thing, worn by someone who understood that the uniform represented centuries of tradition and current operational capability in equal measure. But today was different today. The sound of laughter and sustained gunfire from beyond the treine made him pause at the wooden gate marked Hawkesbury Range members and licensed visitors. Welcome, if you're properly licensed. You're welcome to sign in, the range officer said. Looking up from his clipboard, he was a man in his 60s with steady hands and straight posture that suggested military background. Felix nodded once, pulling out his firearm certificate with practiced efficiency just passing. Through 20 minutes at most, he signed to the logbook in careful handwriting. Clear, legible, no flourishes between G. Weller, retired police, and Bradle Agricultural. He added F. Ward, Armed Forces, without elaboration. The range buzzed with late afternoon. Energy 6 covered firing lanes stretched toward distant targets. Red safety flags snapping in the crosswind. The sharp crack of rifles mixed with the ping of ejected brass hitting concrete, punctuated by the clang of steel targets struck true. Cameron Deal held court at Lane 3 like he owned the place, surrounded by the kind of crowd that gathered around loud confidence and expensive gear. Ex-private security contractor, current YouTube shooter with several thousand followers and enough tactical accessories to outfit a small squad. His rifle was a work of art, if your taste ran toward intimidation. Matte black, everything custom trigger assembly, thermal scope that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage suppressor, engraved. With his channel logo, the kind of setup that looked impressive in videos, but might raise questions about practicality in actual field conditions. That's how you handle precision shooting under pressure. Deal announced after a respectable shot at 200 mm, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to speaking to cameras. Of course it helps when you've got proper training. Not just ceremonial drill and tourist photos. A cluster of younger shooters nodded appreciatively. Smartphones already recording, eager to be part of whatever show Deal was putting on. One of them couldn't have been older than 20, piped up enthusiastically. Is it true what they say about private contractors? That you get better training than regular Army deals? Smiled with practiced modesty. Different training, more practical. When someone's paying you directly, they expect results, not protocol. Felix took lane 6. The quietest spot tucked away at the far end where the shadows were deeper. He removed his tunic with methodical care, folding it precisely over the bench underneath a tight black t-shirt. Revealed the compact build of someone who'd carried heavy kit across difficult terrain. His rifle case was unremarkable worn canvas that had obviously traveled. What emerged was equally unimpressive to the casual observer standard. L85A2, no custom. Modifications, no suppressors, just regulation. Military steel maintained to exacting standards. Felix began laying out his kit with movements so fluid they looked choreographed magazines positioned on the left bore snake, coiled neatly beside cleaning. Supplies patches arranged in order of use, the routine of someone who'd done this thousands of times, in conditions ranging from temperate ranges to desert locations where equipment failure meant more than embarrassment. That's when someone noticed. His grip as Felix conducted his pre-shooting routine. His hands naturally assumed a position that would have looked wrong to anyone who'd learned marksmanship from YouTube tutorials. His strong side thumb caned slightly higher than standard, his support hand pressed flatter against the stock. The whole configuration suggesting adaptation, born from necessity rather than textbook technique. "What's he holding it like that for?" one of the younger men whispered to his friend, not quite quietly, enough to avoid being overheard. The question carried that particular tone of someone genuinely puzzled by a deviation from what they'd been taught was correct. Felix didn't react. He was focused on reading conditions, wind flags positioned downrange, the subtle shift in light, the way dust moved in the air between firing points, details that most recreational shooters never considered. But that could mean the difference between a hit and a miss when precision mattered. "That's not how you're supposed to hold it," someone else added, this time with the confidence of someone who'd watched enough instructional videos to consider themselves knowledgeable. "Thumb should be parallel to the bore axis for proper recoil control." But Felix remained focused on his sight picture, making minute adjustments that had nothing to do with the commentary behind him. His breathing had shifted to the controlled rhythm of someone preparing for precision work. Cameron Deal noticed the attention shifting toward the end lane and sensed an opportunity to demonstrate his expertise. While building content for his next video, the gathering crowd around his own position had started glancing toward Lane 6. And Deal had learned that maintaining audience focus required constant performance. "That grip tells me everything I need to know," he announced loud enough to ensure his commentary would be picked up by the phones already recording. Classic example of someone who looks the part, but probably couldn't group shots to save his life. Probably learned that grip from someone who never actually had to use it under pressure. A few chuckles followed from his immediate audience. Someone adjusted their phone angle slightly, sensing the potential for an entertaining comparison between the loud contractor with his expensive gear and the quiet guardsman with his basic rifle. Felix set his target at 300 meters further than most of the day's shooting had attempted, while Deal continued playing to his growing audience. But he didn't lift the rifle immediately. He was patient, letting the crowd settle into their assumptions, allowing them to become comfortable with their own confidence about what they thought they were witnessing. Deal's voice grew more pointed, encouraged by the reactions he was getting. "Oi, Palace Guard," he called out, using the kind of tone that suggested familiarity, while actually demonstrating ignorance of proper military forms of address. "You planning to actually shoot that thing, or are you waiting for permission from the Queen?" The laughter that followed carried the easy cruelty of a crowd that had decided it knew what it was looking at. Not malicious exactly, but dismissive in the way that groups become when someone provides them with a target that seems safe to mock. Felix clicked his safety off, then immediately back on a small gesture that was actually automatic safety verification, drilled into him during specialized training. "See that?" Deal shook his head with theatrical disappointment. "He's nervous. Look at that grip, completely wrong for accurate shooting. That breathing pattern, too long, too deliberate. Guys obviously never fired a live round under actual pressure." More snorts from the growing gallery. More phones angled toward Lane 6. Their operators, hoping to capture whatever embarrassment was about to unfold. But Gareth Whitman, former Royal Artillery NCO and current range safety officer, was watching with different eyes. He'd spent enough time around real shooters to recognize the difference. Between parade ground posture and operational positioning, something about the guard's absolute stillness reminded him of the specialists he'd worked with during his deployment to Helmand Province, the ones who never talked about their previous assignments, but whose presence changed the entire dynamic of any operation. Watching the guardsman, now Gareth felt recognition stirring the way Felix held himself. Wasn't the bearing of someone trying to look military. It was the unconscious posture of someone shaped by experiences that demanded absolute competence under conditions where failure carried terminal consequences. Felix reached for his water bottle with deliberate calm, took one measured sip, and returned to position. The movement was economical, unhurried, the response of someone who understood that emotional reactions were tactical mistakes. The position looked different from textbook examples, but anyone with actual operational experience would have recognized it immediately. It was a grip adapted for specific conditions, modified through necessity, rather than theory. Felix's breathing slowed to an almost imperceptible rhythm. His trigger finger moved to position with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested thousands of hours of practice, in conditions where getting it wrong wasn't just embarrassing. It was fatal. The range seemed to quiet around him, not because other shooters had stopped firing, but because his focus had narrowed to the point where external distractions ceased to exist. He exhaled once, slow and controlled, then pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked. Across the range with authority not louder than any other shot that day, but somehow different, cleaner, more definitive. The sound carried a finality that suggested someone who had learned to make first-round hits under conditions where second chances weren't available 300 meters downrange. Steel sang out with a perfect ringing note that cut through the afternoon air like a bell dead center. Felix didn't pause to admire his work, just worked the action with smooth efficiency and settled back into position. The second shot followed 12 seconds later, and the steel sang again by the third shot. Deal had stopped talking to his audience by the fifth. The background chatter from other lanes had died away completely. Everyone was listening now, not to the shooter but to the rhythm of precision itself, the metronomic pattern of someone who had turned marksmanship into a form of mechanical art. Each shot followed the same pattern, the subtle shift in position, the controlled breathing, the perfectly timed trigger press. Then the musical note of steel struck true. No wasted motion, no unnecessary flourishes, just relentless accuracy that transcended simple marksmanship. Felix fired his final 3 rounds with the same methodical calm. He'd shown from the beginning each shot placed with the kind of precision that transcended simple marksmanship and entered the realm of genuine expertise. When the 10th round struck steel with the same perfect note as the previous 9, he simply lowered the weapon, engaged the safety with an audible click, and rested the rifle against the bench like he was setting down a tool after completing routine maintenance. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Even the mechanical sounds of other shooters seemed muted, as if the entire range was processing what it had just witnessed. Deal stood frozen beside his expensive equipment, his expression cycling through disbelief, recognition, and something that might have been embarrassment. The range officer, a different man from the one who had signed Felix in this one, wearing the kind of weathered jacket that suggested decades of exposure to outdoor shooting, walked downrange to examine the target with professional interest. His movements were unhurried but purposeful, the gait of someone who had seen enough shooting to recognize when something special had just occurred. When he returned, his voice carried clearly across the suddenly quiet range lane. 6 perfect grouping. 10 rounds, 1 centimeter deviation maximum. The silence that followed was profound. 1 centimeter at 300 menor, with iron sights, wasn't just good shooting. It was instructor-level precision. Gareth Whitman felt recognition click into place. He'd seen shooting like that before during joint operations where precision meant the difference between mission success and disaster. Deal finally found his voice, though it lacked the confident swagger that had characterized his earlier commentary. That's impressive shooting," he managed the admission clearly, costing him considerable effort. Good grouping with basic equipment, but his audience was no longer paying attention to him. The phones that had been focused on his demonstration earlier were now pointed toward Lane 6, their operators trying to capture whatever additional performance might follow this unexpected display of genuine expertise. One of the younger shooters who had been hanging on Deal's every word earlier now spoke with the kind of awed confusion that comes from having your assumptions completely overturned. "How did he do that? I mean, the grip looked completely wrong," but his voice trailed off as he struggled to reconcile what he had been taught about proper technique with what he had just witnessed. Gareth decided it was time to provide some context. "You military?" he asked Felix, his tone carrying the respectful courtesy that one veteran extends to another when genuine competence has been demonstrated. Felix glanced at him and gave a single nod, his expression remaining neutral but not unfriendly. "Which regiment?" Gareth continued using the kind of specific terminology that indicated his own military background. "Royal Regiment of Scotland," Felix replied, offering the information without elaboration or boasting. Gareth's eyebrows rose slightly. The Royal Regiment was well regarded within military circles, but their standard training didn't typically produce the kind of marksmanship they'd just witnessed. "They teach shooting like that in Scotland." Felix shook his head once, a small gesture that somehow conveyed volumes about experiences that couldn't be discussed in civilian company not there. The implication hung in the air like cordite smoke. The older Navy veteran who had been watching quietly from the observation bench stepped closer, his weathered face thoughtful as he processed what he'd seen and heard. "That grip," he said, carefully choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood that certain subjects required delicate handling. "Seen it before Falklands. Actually, our sniper attached from Special Boat Service shot that way. Said he'd adapted his technique after working with American specialists, who modified their hold for different operational requirements." Felix didn't confirm or deny the observation, but something in his continued stillness suggested that the veteran's comment wasn't entirely wrong. The grip that everyone had mocked wasn't a mistake or poor training. It was an adaptation developed through experience in situations where standard techniques might not be optimal. Deal attempted to salvage some credibility. "Look, that's solid range shooting. No question, but range precision and field application are completely different things." The Navy veteran's expression shifted to something approaching amusement. "You think that was just casual shooting? That's someone who learned marksmanship under the sobering reality that missing can cost lives." The observation was made without any drama or conflict, but it resonated with the insight of someone who had witnessed similar skills in actual combat scenarios. Felix had started disassembling his rifle with the same deliberate care he had demonstrated during its assembly, giving each element attention that exceeded mere upkeep. He cleaned the action with a precision born out of training that prioritized the reliability of gear, thoroughly drying every component with meticulousness learned in environments where mechanical breakdowns could lead to dire results. Deal made yet another attempt to assert his position as the authority figure among the Rangers. "That was exceptional shooting, but I'm curious about something. Do you mind telling me where you picked up that grip? It's certainly not part of standard British military training." The inquiry held just the right amount of challenge, indicating that Deal still hadn't fully grasped the predicament he had created for himself. Felix raised his gaze from his rifle case, meeting Deal's eyes for the first time since the shooting. Concluded. When he replied, his tone was steady, devoid of any ego or defensiveness. "Some techniques aren't covered in the manual," he stated calmly. "You acquire them from those who have operated in places where the manual falls short." The response was precisely measured, informative enough to clarify the competence that everyone had observed while ensuring no details could endanger operational security or personal confidentiality. It acknowledged advanced training without disclosing specifics that could be problematic if misused. Deal's expression shifted slightly as he began to grasp the underlying implications of the answer. He was starting to realize that his earlier comments had been aimed at someone whose qualifications and experience far surpassed his own contractor background. One of the teenagers who had been filming earlier lowered his phone and approached, with the clumsy eagerness of youth encountering something truly admirable. "Sir, may I ask you something?" Felix raised an eyebrow in acknowledgement. "What's it like standing guard at Buckingham Palace? I mean, after doing other things." The question was naive yet genuinely curious, reflecting a level of interest that seemed to sit better with Felix than Deal's prior provocations. Felix pondered the inquiry with the same meticulous consideration he had applied to his rifle preparation, weighing his response as if calculating wind adjustments. "It's different," he finally replied, quieter. "Not easier, just different. You learn to adjust your perspective when the stakes change." The answer was candid without being overly specific, recognizing the weight of experience while maintaining confidentiality and avoiding sensitive information. During their conversation, the crowd around Lane 6 had increased, attracted by the kind of authentic competence that didn't require any self-promotion. Many of the other shooters had approached with the respectful curiosity professionals exhibit in the presence of genuine expertise, pausing their own practice to witness any subsequent demonstrations. However, Felix wasn't inclined to entertain further queries. He secured his rifle case with practiced efficiency, shouldered his kit bag, and readied to depart with the same quiet determination. The professionalism he displayed throughout the afternoon had shifted the atmosphere of the range. Conversations became more subdued and introspective. Several younger shooters who had previously laughed at Felix's grip were now examining their own rifles with newfound doubt, questioning if there were techniques and strategies they had overlooked. Deal lingered near his gear, seemingly cleaning his rifle, yet evidently contemplating the events that had unfolded. His costly modifications and tactical gear felt less impressive, appearing more as a shield for essential skill and knowledge deficits. As Felix got ready to depart, Gareth approached him. "Are you making your way back to town?" Felix looked towards the path leading to the station. "That way, yes. Mind if I join you for part of the way?" Gareth inquired. "There's a nearby pub, the King's Head, a quiet spot with decent bitter. No social media distractions, just genuine conversation among those who grasp what authentic shooting entails." Felix hesitated, weighing the invitation, and after a moment nodded. "That sounds more appealing than spending the evening being observed like an exhibit in a museum." They made their way from the range, boots crunching on gravel while the afternoon light dimmed into evening. Behind them, the sounds of shooting blended with softer dialogues, but the atmosphere undeniably shifted. The casual arrogance that had infused the earlier moments was supplanted by a more thoughtful and respectful air. At the gate, an older man dressed in civilian clothes called out gently, "Guardsman!" Felix halted and turned, his expression one of polite attentiveness. The man stepped forward, his face weathered by time, yet his stance hinted at a military background. "My grandson is currently in initial training with the paras. He constantly asks me about what real soldiers are like, and whether the stories regarding elite units are fact or mere propaganda." Felix waited, sensing the man had more to convey. "After watching you shoot today," the man continued, "I believe I'll tell him that the most dangerous soldiers are often the quietest ones, and that true training reveals itself in what you don't feel the need to prove." Felix met his gaze with a steady attention, demonstrating genuine respect for the man's viewpoint. "Your grandson is in capable hands with the paras, sir. They'll ensure he learns everything essential." "I'm confident they will," the man replied. "But it's reassuring to know individuals like you are out there, prepared when called upon." Their exchange encapsulated a vital aspect of service: the notion that duty persists without the need for acknowledgement, that capability is upheld for its own merit rather than for public recognition. With that, Felix and Gareth continued along the dirt path toward the main road, their dialogue quiet yet comfortable. They discussed shooting techniques, military training, and the distinctions between operational needs and civilian uses. Technical discussions shared by those who had a grounded understanding of the subject from first-hand experience. Upon arriving at the pub, it was precisely as Gareth had described: a classic English country establishment with low ceilings, aged wooden floors, and an atmosphere encouraging hushed conversations over boisterous performances. Felix ordered a pint of the local bitter and settled into a corner. A table positioned so that he could lean against the wall reflected a tendency likely rooted in moments when awareness was essential for survival. During the night, several other patrons noticed Felix's uniform and approached him with a mix of respect and curiosity. However, their discussions remained quiet and sincere, revolving around themes such as service, tradition, and the delicate balance between public obligations and personal skills. As Felix prepared to depart, Gareth accompanied him to the exit. "You know," he remarked, "I've been involved in shooting sports for 15 years and encountered all kinds of marksmen, but I've never witnessed someone making a statement quite like yours today." Felix gave a slight shrug. He wasn't aiming to prove a point, but rather responding to someone in need of insight about their observations. "That's fair," Gareth conceded, "but you should be aware that half of those young men will be leaving tonight with a new perspective on service, capability, and what true skill encompasses, especially when it doesn't need to showcase itself." Felix pondered this, thinking that perhaps this shift in understanding wasn't a bad outcome, definitely not a negative one. Gareth agreed, noting that the world could benefit from individuals who realize that authentic strength doesn't require proclamation. They exchanged a brief, firm handshake, marked by a mutual respect for the value they saw in one another. As Felix made his way back through the darkening countryside towards the train station, his kit bag securely slung over his shoulder, his thoughts began transitioning towards the responsibilities awaiting him the next day. The evening air carried the scent of oncoming rain from the west, with the first lights of farmhouse windows dotted across the undulating terrain. Tomorrow, he would don the red tunic and bare skin, standing absolutely still while tourists snapped photographs and formed assumptions about the ceremonial soldiers. He would uphold the famous silence as people speculated on whether the guards were genuine soldiers or merely decorative figures maintained for the sake of tradition. They wouldn't realize that the quiet man holding the rifle had honed his skills in situations where precision equated to survival, where the unusual grip they might notice had evolved out of necessity in scenarios that never made it into official accounts, just as it should be. Felix Ward had showcased his abilities to a small group of civilians at a Sussex shooting range, not out of a need for respect or validation, but because someone had questioned the competence implied by his uniform. He had clarified the disparity between appearance and reality, assumption and fact, and the difference between discussing marksmanship and executing it effectively when necessary. The following day, he would revert to the silent duty of guarding, carrying both his visible roles and invisible qualifications with the same professional dignity that marked his performance today. The train back to London was almost deserted, granting Felix a window seat from which he could observe the countryside gradually retreat into darkness. His reflection revealed an individual who appeared unremarkable, of average height and build, dressed in civilian attire that concealed his history. Just another passenger heading home after an ordinary day, which suited him perfectly. Felix. Ward had made his statement with 10 shots and a grip that seemed unusual to everyone except those who understood why it was, in fact, precisely right. He was now returning to the serene duty of standing guard, prepared to be whoever the situation demanded of him, ceremonial figure, operational soldier, or something in between. The most formidable presence in any room, as the tourists tomorrow would never realize, often went unnoticed entirely. Have you ever drastically miscalculated someone's abilities based solely on their appearance or unconventional methods, only to find yourself proved remarkably wrong? Which do you find more impressive? Someone who incessantly talks about their abilities, or one who demonstrates them only when required? How frequently do we confuse quiet competence with weakness, or presume that someone without boasting about their background must lack one? If this narrative has shifted your perception of those in ceremonial roles, making you acknowledge that there could be more beneath the surface than what first meets the eye, hit that like button to show these accounts are meaningful to you. Don't forget to subscribe and activate that notification bell to ensure you don't miss our daily stories about professionals whose respect is earned through actions rather than words. Those who carry their qualifications discreetly and employ them only when the occasion necessitates. If you know anyone who equates ceremony with weakness or assumes that unconventional methods must be incorrect, share this video with them to reveal the consequences when assumptions collide with reality. An extraordinary Royal Guard story awaits you on your screen right now, featuring another type of discreet professional whose abilities astonished everyone who underestimated him. Check it out, and we'll reconvene tomorrow with another tale, illustrating that the most dangerous individuals typically are the ones who feel no need to indicate their perilous nature. Until then, keep in mind that real skill requires no self-promotion, and the finest soldiers often keep their true capabilities concealed until the precise moment they are called into action.